Marcus Troiano. I'm a senior consultant on the strategy side of things at Mandiant. We're a cybersecurity consulting firm. You might know us from the work we've done with a lot of the major attacks in the recent years, trying to really help companies recover from those attacks and to find out who did them. As was mentioned earlier, we did a lot of work in kind of the first naming of the China-based APT group that had launched a series of attacks against American corporations and government. Yeah. So what we're seeing is technology really change everything we do in our lives. So to come to work today, I used Uber. Or to come here, I used Uber. I did some online banking on the way here. I checked emails. I wrote some reports. Totally connected. I think we all are. We can all see that, right? And this is great. It's made things more efficient, more convenient, but it's also added a certain complexity and also additional risk. So the surface of attack that can be exploited is vastly increased. So instead of having for example, the bank robbery example, the physical avenue to attack, we now have many avenues through mobile, through email, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very broadening attack surface. And as a result of that, in the last few years, we've seen an explosion of attacks. So we've seen everything from individual companies to governments to all kinds of entities being targeted for either their intellectual property, the intelligence they hold, the information they have. And we see attackers that are very well resourced. So I think if we even think about 2-3 years ago, we thought of hackers as someone in their parents' basement on a computer they have and just kind of having fun, seeing what they can do. But I think that image is still around, but attackers now are very well organized. They're very, very well funded in some cases. They're funded by states. They act upon orders. They have lots of time and resources, and they have a mission to achieve. Some recent trends we've been seeing in the last year from the attacks we've been responding to. We've seen a lot of attacks kind of really focusing on disruption. So whether that is for political disruption, as in the recent DNC hacks, where a third party or potential nation state wants to potentially interfere or change election results through embarrassing news and intelligence, or whether it's a company that has their data taken hostage, either for reputational issues or to make a payment. We've seen a huge explosion of ransomware and different disruptive attacks, whereas before we would maybe just see more targeting of information. We've also seen a lot of activity on the PII front, so a lot of instead of intellectual property, actual data being stolen on individuals, because it is far easier from an intelligence gathering perspective to break into, let's say, a bank database, let's say an airline, a hotel chain, other firms, and steal that information on hundreds of millions or millions of individuals, as opposed to gathering that in bulk, right? So it's a very cheap way of gathering intelligence. We've also seen a lot of increase on attacks on infrastructure that has typically not been included in kind of how we view security as much, kind of building blocks of the internet and different routers and switches that are used by companies as well as the internet, et cetera. Those are now being targeted, and we're discovering exploits that have been taken advantage of to great effect. Just a graphic I saw a few weeks ago in the Financial Times, but essentially, the scope of these breaches in terms of the theft of records and how many people it could potentially affect is very, very broad, very great. Like the Yahoo breach a few weeks ago, 500 million accounts, right? We're seeing 70 million, JP Morgan, Anthem 80 million. These are highly confidential files, potentially very valuable. And we went through this, some other speakers talked about this in more detail as well. I'll just kind of glance over it. But again, there's broadly four, or more main motivators for attackers. So there's the espionage component, there's a cybercrime component, there's also disruption, and the commercial component. So we've kind of seen, if you look at the last 2 years of breaches, you can kind of roughly put them in all these different boxes. So we, either when it's nation state driven, or it's financial crime syndicates, etc. There's definitely either a monetary component or a political component or an intelligence, etc. component. When we look at the types of attacks, as was mentioned earlier as well, majority of these attacks still exploit the human aspect. So 95% of every major attack that my firm has investigated, and I think broadly across the industry, has started with spear phishing. So very targeted, an attacker doing research on the individuals involved in the company, trying to mimic people they know, reaffirm them with information that is relevant, that is true, and being able to go in through kind of the soft core of the company as opposed to attacking the actual castle walls. So we're definitely seeing attackers, changing their tactics as well. Even 2 or 3 years ago, they would use their own infrastructure to launch attacks. So it was much easier to actually trace these attacks where they came from. Now we're seeing, the usage of shared hosting, shared services, proxy, et cetera, botnets. It's much more difficult, but it also is much easier for them to scale. So as an attacker, they can easily set up a new environment and launch an attack, take it down, set up another one. It's a really easy way for them to quickly adapt and to outsmart the defenders. In terms of, this was mentioned actually earlier as well, but the average time that we've seen a company takes to actually realize they've been compromised and data has been stolen is 146 days in our last year of major incidents we responded to. So as you can see, the trend is actually going downwards, but simply put, in 146 days, if an attacker has complete access to your environment, what can't they steal? Or what can't they destroy or affect, right? So again, these are worrying stats. When we look at, kind of was brainstorming some kind of challenges and potential solutions, I think attribution, again, that's really difficult. A lot of government agencies, companies, et cetera, they do a good job at this, but it's still very, very difficult to actually find out who launched an attack, who did it. As a result, and part of the problem as well is jurisdictions. It's very, very hard, as we just heard from Inspector Coxon, that to actually prosecute or to actually bring justice. So without the risk of justice, a lot of attackers can act with impunity. We also see, again, a lot more attacks that are now attacking kind of new areas. So IoT, we just saw the Internet of Things, 2 recent attacks leveraging botnets that are basically made up of all these devices that are now internet connected. So again, new avenues for attack, leveraging new technologies, and potential risks of autonomous vehicles. Again, this is a great technology that has the potential to save millions of lives from traffic accidents. You can basically erase traffic accidents. But if an attacker is able to get access to those cars, they can cause human death. Same with the electricity grid or with water supply. I've done some work recently with some US states on securing their water supply and their power systems. Again, these are technologies that have been stood up back in the 70s, 80s, or even before sometimes. And they were not meant to be connected to internet. And slowly, a lot of them have become connected, even without them knowing. So again, these are very worrying potential risks. We've also seen over the summer, again, with the shadow broker attack at potential NSA, tools being stolen. There's a lot of vulnerabilities, exploits, zero-day exploits. So weaknesses in critical software and systems that has been stockpiled increasingly by national security agencies, which again are used for offensive measures. But on the flip side, there's a certain balance of the good of the people and privacy of the people and intelligence requirements. Because if you are stockpiling those kind of vulnerabilities, an attacker can find those. So that was the whole issue with Apple as well. If they were to build a backdoor into their phone, sure, it could definitely help law enforcement and intelligence. But it also has a flip side of allowing the attacker to potentially, or the bad guys, to find that same weakness, right? So we want to make sure that we balance security requirements, surveillance with, again, the individual rights and whatnot. Some potential solutions, intelligence sharing, this was brought up earlier in the financial sector. This is very successful. I think we have to expand this. We have to spend more time at figuring out how private companies as well as governments can share information, or even governments share information within their different agencies and between governments. I think, again, standardizing the way they share information and not holding back, because really, if we're able to be forewarned of attacker behavior, of upcoming attacks, we can do a much better job of actually preventing them. And not necessarily preventing them, but being able to respond a lot quicker and a lot more effectively. Also, some interesting points around actual regulation. I know this came up earlier as well, but I think regulation is something that has to be looked at. I think right now the penalties associated with failure for a company or a government to not protect the data of their customers or the citizens are a slap on the wrist. I think there has to be more of a standards, whether that's guidance driven or that's more prescriptive. I think something has to be done to really bring in a common framework. That's being done now on the critical infrastructure side with NERC, for example, for power, and PCI for financial services for card data. But this is really, really elementary. I think there has to be a higher level of kind of a requirement for protection of this data and of systems. And a lot of companies that are involved in designing software, making products, secure coding is something that is not being followed enough. And it could prevent a lot of these major attacks because there's a lot of vulnerabilities that have, again, not meaningfully been put into code and products, but just through kind of a sloppy approach or a quick to market strategy. These are serious risks because, again, that undermines potential security of many, many other things. So doctors and other companies that are in certain industries have a certain level of care required. Software engineers don't have that same level. I'm not saying anything against them. I'm just saying there needs to be a higher level of standards. And again, looking at geopolitics and the rules of engagement, I think it's really important to look at recent agreements between, for example, China and the U.S., China and the UK. They've actually come to terms of when we're talking about economic espionage and the theft of intellectual property, they have now come to a certain agreement that they will not fully support that. They won't do it. They won't support it. Does it still happen? Sure, but it's not as open. We've seen actually a decline in those kind of attacks. And there's a huge importance to get to a greater level of international agreement around the rules of engagement for cyber, because it can be used to cause, human death and extreme harm in certain circumstances. So there needs to be, the same as there is with landmines and nuclear weapons, some kind of agreement around how you engage from a cyber perspective and what the actual rules are for that. From a technology perspective and kind of people and process, again, there's no simple solution. Some of the things that we see working, this is a more technical level. But again, understanding where your data is, understanding who has access to it, controlling that access, minimize basically room for vulnerability, making sure things are up to date, vulnerabilities are patched, making sure that you have plans to respond to. So as I mentioned earlier, in the military, again, drills are very important. So be able to actually test out your response plans to see if they actually work. Everyone's ready to respond to an incident. And really promote security culture. I think it's really important. Again, 95% of attacks are starting with spear phishing against an individual, or as was mentioned earlier as well, kind of a CEO fraud where people are asked to wire funds over. That's about awareness. And I think literacy and awareness are incredibly important, both from a government as well as a individual perspective and company perspective. So kind of just to end my portion of this, essentially, I think we're going to see a continuing of attacks that are more innovative, constantly changing, always trying to outwit kind of the defenders. But at the same time, we are seeing a change of awareness, both in the public space as well as government space. There's a lot of very good initiatives that are starting to take place. It's happening very slowly, a bit too slowly, but it's good news in that there is now awareness. I think it's being now treated less as an IT risk and more of an enterprise or governance risk, policy risk. I mean, this has the potential to touch on everything. And I think it's very, very important that governments, again, lead that strategy, make a very clear kind of push towards a more secure world as that becomes much more critical. There's a lot of money being spent in this area, a lot of it not spent wisely, some of it being spent wisely as well. But I think it's really, really important, again, to look at this beyond technology and look at it from the human perspective, the process perspective, again, the governance perspective. Thank you.